God, thank you so much for the start of another week, and we thank you for the opportunity to come together as your people and hear more about what you had to reveal in Genesis, the promises that you made to Abraham and to his family, and how you fulfilled those. Please be with us as we read about the conclusion of Abraham's life and the start of Isaac's role in your big plan. Bless us this morning and give us wisdom and insight into these things. Thank you so much for your word and for the grace and the mercy that we have through your Son. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so for those of you who are joining us for the first time or visiting, we've been doing an overview of the book of Genesis. So we have been looking at all 50 chapters. This is a very high-level study. We're covering 4 to 6 chapters a class, so very high level. This is the outline that we're following. Today, as I mentioned, we're down about 3/4 of the way through that list. We're concluding Abraham's story. We're going to start in 22, and by the time we're done, we're going to be into chapter 25, so part of the way through Isaac's story. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah this morning. As far as our weekly reading list, I think we're the 5th one down. Pretty soon we're going to be getting down to Joseph's story, and his story takes up a huge chunk of the book of Genesis. Okay.
Do we have that down somewhere, paper, anywhere?
We were going to make a copy of that, weren't we? Yep. Yeah, we need a copy of that. Hey, I'll leave that up there. Anyone who wants to take a picture of that, grab a picture of that. And for those who haven't been familiar with that, this is taken from the annual reading list of the Hebrew Torah. So they go through the book of Genesis in 12 weeks. And the beginning, the title there is the opening words of each of those sections in Hebrew. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, let me see if I can back it up using this clicker. There you go. All right, you got that one? You got to zoom in. Did I? Well, I might need to send it again. Is what I'm hearing. Okay, so this is where we ended last week, and like I said, it felt really rushed because we were trying to fit it in. And it's such an important chapter. You know, I took a Wednesday night invitation from it just this last week. Genesis 22 has to do with the offering of Isaac. The Jewish people call it the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Akedah means binding. So when it says he bound him before he offered him, that's that word. When you look down through the text, this is the structure. You have verses 1 and 2 where it says God is going to test Abraham, and then him giving that test. In verses 3 through 10, Abraham meets the challenge. He does what God says to do. He takes Isaac to the place that God was going to show him. God acknowledges Abraham's faith in verses 11 and 12. He stops the sacrifice. Verse 13, he offers the substitution of the ram, which Abraham told Isaac on the way up, look, God's going to provide, right? And then in verse 14, the naming of the altar. And then 15 through 19, God reaffirms the blessings that he's given him all through his life since about 75 years old. And then in verses 20 through 24, you have the offspring of Nahor. Important phrases in the chapter. God putting Abraham to the test. The here I am in verse 1. God is going to provide in verses 8 and 14. And the idea of being bound when he bound Isaac in verse 9. So look at chapter 22. And maybe what we can do, we haven't done this a lot in this class because we've gone so fast. Let's just kind of read through each of those sections and see if anybody has any thoughts or questions down through there. Okay, does someone want to read verses 1 and 2, please?
Yeah, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you.
Okay. What do you guys think about God's testing of him there? It's always, every time I read it, it gets harder the older I get, especially once you have kids of your own. Like, that's a big deal. And I love my kids. Like, I think I've got the best kids. But they weren't the promised ones that God was going to fulfill all of these great promises through, right? I wasn't waiting 25 years for this one to show up. But for Abraham, that's what Isaac was to him. We made a connection last time between Genesis 12 and Genesis 22. That back when God originally called Abram, he told him to go forth to the land that I will show you. And he says something very similar here. Go to the land of Moriah on the heights that I will point out to you. Very, very similar. And then he has this threefold statement. I want you to leave your land, leave your homeland, leave your father's house. And then when he identifies Isaac, he says, I want you to take your son, your favorite son, Isaac whom you love. So like there's this threefold statement. Back in Genesis 12, there are these promises of, I'm going to make you a great nation. And then God repeats those promises in 22. When the whole thing was over, there were promises, blessings that God gave at the Oak of Moreh back in Genesis 12. And then here, Abraham receives promises at Moriah. So Moreh, Moriah. In both places, Abraham built an altar. And in both places, you have a genealogy kind of introducing the next big character. So big similarities between the beginning of Abraham's story in the Bible and how his story starts to wind down in the Bible. And I had not noticed that until this time studying through Genesis, getting ready for this class. I thought that was kind of cool.
Question.
Yep.
That Mount Moriah, is that close to where Jesus was sacrificed?
Great question. Mount Moriah. So Mount Moriah, Genesis 22:2, where we are in this text, is where Abraham bound Isaac. It was about a 3-day journey from Beersheba, is what the text tells us. And then later on in 2 Samuel 24, David purchased a threshing floor from Ornan the Jebusite. The city of Jebus is where Jerusalem was built. Okay, so during David's life, he had some military men conquer Jebus, and then eventually he bought a threshing floor from one of the remaining survivors. And then in 2 Chronicles 3, Solomon constructed the temple on Mount Moriah on the threshing floor purchased from Ornan. So I don't have them pulled up here. I could show you guys pictures. So you all recognize that golden dome in the background? You all remember what that's called? Yeah, it's the Dome of the Rock. The top of the Temple Mount is maintained and occupied by Palestinian Muslims, right? And so there are 2 mosques up there. You've got the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is toward the end of the platform. And then in the middle of the platform, you have the Dome of the Rock. And that big dome is over the top of a cave. And down inside the cave is traditionally where they believe Abraham offered Isaac. They believe that Abraham offered Ishmael, but Jews believe that Abraham offered Isaac based on this text. Well, they have their own versions of the Genesis story that has a lot of similarities, but very significant deviations, right? So we know that Jesus was often up at the Temple Mount. There are actually some first century steps that still exist that Jesus most likely used on a regular basis to go up into the temple, right? And not too far from there in the old city of Jerusalem is Calvary or Golgotha. So right around the corner from there is where Jesus was sacrificed. Right? So really similar location. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Maybe next time I can show some of the pictures that I've taken, because I've actually had the privilege of being in both the Al-Aqsa Mosque and in the Dome of the Rock inside the cave. There's some really neat pictures from inside there. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's keep looking at the text here. Let's pick up with verse 3, and somebody read 3 through 10.
So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. To 10?
Yep, through 10.
When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son.
Okay. There are a couple of things that are hard about this test. What are some of the things in your mind that are hard about this test? Okay, and that's what we mentioned earlier. Like, as a parent, that would be really hard. What about the nature and the character of God? Does this request seem consistent with what we know about God?
Between this and the story of Jephthah and his daughter, it seems at odds with his forbidding the sacrifices to Molech.
Okay. Yeah, the idea of human sacrifice is inconsistent with God's value of human life, right? He actually forbade the Israelites from doing that kind of stuff. And there were even some types of animal sacrifice that he did not want them involved with, right? So for him to ask Abraham, to do something that he has never asked anyone to do, at first glance, you'd be like, was that really God talking? Was that really God? Now, later on in the New Testament, specifically in Hebrews, what did Abraham think would happen here? Okay, God has not done that yet before. So Abraham has so much faith in God and knows God's character so well, he's like, this doesn't sound like God, so that must mean he's got another way of solving this. Because Isaac is the son. He's the promised one. Like, he's supposed to grow up, live a long life, have all these kids, and that can't happen if he's dead in the ground. So Abraham's trying to figure out a way where God can keep his promises to him, but still go through with this.
Verse 3 shows that he thought he would spare Isaac.
That he was what?
Spare.
Yeah, that's right. So that statement of faith, when Isaac is like, hey, where's the animal? He's like,
He says, me and the boy will come back.
when he's talking to his servant, yeah. He fully expects Isaac to be raised.
Yeah.
Okay? So at first glance, like, that's one of the reasons I would wrestle with this. If God told me to do this, I would wrestle with it because it seems inconsistent with what I know about God. And I'm sure Abraham did. And this wasn't something he could do in 30 minutes impulsively. And like, it took him multiple days to get there, multiple days to mull this over. If it were me, I would probably not be sleeping at night. All right, but he gets there, and where we stopped reading, like if you don't know the rest of the story, Isaac's a dead boy. Because he raises his hand to slaughter him. It's like he's just about to do it.
Which direction did Abraham come from?
That's a good question. Right off the bat, I can't remember the direction of Beersheba to Moriah. I think so. It's either north or south. It was not east or west. But
That's the Beersheba today.
yes.
That's south.
So Beersheba is north of Moriah. You're saying it's south of Moriah, so he went north.
So that's the
Where's
hard
my
way
phone?
to get to the mountain.
Yeah,
You got to climb that hill. 'Cause from
True.
the north, it's a more gentle slope.
correct. Yeah, that's a good point to make too.
There's a big valley.
Mm-hmm. So what does God do? How urgent is God in stopping Abraham? Yeah, very last second, right? So this is not like previous chapters where God sent angels in the appearance of men to have a dialogue with them. Like there's no time for that. So God communicates through a voice. In verse 11, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven. So there's an intermediary, but it's a representative for God. And he gets his attention by saying his name twice. Abraham, Abraham. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And what does he say? Here I am. Same thing. Says the same thing. Let's just read 11 and 12. The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Let's talk about this for a second. God's omniscient. God already knew. Was this for God's benefit? Whose benefit was it for? Okay, I think they're definitely for Abraham's. Ours. Because Abraham was justified by his faith. And his story starts with faith in chapter 12, and his story winds down with faith here in 22. Extreme examples of faith. Like there are other places, especially in the Old Testament, where it's going to say God tested his people. Like God tested the Israelites as they were wandering in the wilderness. Was that so God would figure some stuff out about them? Because he knew they were a stiff-necked and hard-hearted people. What was he trying to do? Who was the test for? Them. So that they would know. Right? And there are similar ideas in the New Testament as well when it talks about God testing people. And what is revealed by the test for all of us is his fear of God, his awe of God, seeing that he wouldn't withhold his most beloved son from God. Yeah, Joe?
Doesn't that also show faith is obedient faith?
Yeah, so a great way to define faith, I think Paul does a really good job with it over in Romans, at the beginning and the end of Romans, when he uses the phrase to bring about the obedience of faith. And the idea is biblical faith is a belief that responds. It's a belief that responds. And that's a great modern way of saying that. So, like, if I told y'all there were $1 million in a certain closet here in the church building, and the first one to get there got the $1 million. I don't have $1 million to give you. But if you believed that, how would you respond? You'd start looking in all the closets. Right? Biblical faith is a belief in the words that are spoken that responds to the words that are spoken. Does that make sense? And Abraham is such a great example of that. Okay, let's look at 13. I love 13. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold really should be at the beginning of the verse. I think it is in the Hebrew. Behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Like God had set this up for a sacrifice to take place, and a sacrifice was going to take place. But instead of Abraham offering Isaac, God had providentially provided a ram ahead of time, knowing that Abraham would need it. I don't know how long that ram was stuck, but it was stuck for long enough that it was there when Abraham needed it. And you remember what Abraham said on the way up when Isaac questioned him, hey, where is the sacrifice? Where's the offering? And what did he say? God will provide. So verse 14, Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. What does that make you think of? Who does that make you think of? Starts with a J and ends with Jesus. Okay? It's Jesus. It's Jesus. We all need an atoning sacrifice. We all deserve the wrath of God because of our sin. And instead of us dying, instead of us paying the price for our penalty, God provides a substitute. And God planned for that substitute all the way along before we even knew we needed it. Until at the right time, there was a sacrifice available for us. This is foreshadowing Jesus way back here in Genesis 22. And I think that's awesome. And one of the big contrasts, though, is this. Abraham with his son. Was Abraham willing to offer his son? But did he end up offering his son? Was God willing to offer his son? Did he go through with it? Big difference between the two. Was Isaac the son that Abraham loved? Was Jesus the son? Yeah, see, all the similarities there pointing to Jesus. So many similarities. Okay? So, you can keep reading down through that chapter. I mean, you get the promises that are repeated. You get the genealogy of Nahor, and the reason that's there is to introduce Rebekah. Because in verse 23, Bethuel fathered Rebekah. They're trying to explain where Rebekah comes from, and we're going to see her in chapter 24. Anything else stand out to you all about 22? Thank you for going through that with me a little bit slower. I think that chapter especially deserved more time than we gave it. All right, let's talk about chapter 23. It's a shorter chapter. The first 2 verses, you have the death of Sarah, who lived 127 years. In verses 3 through 9, you have Abraham appeal to the Hittites. He's trying to secure a place to bury Sarah. He doesn't have a place. He's a sojourner. He doesn't have a land. He doesn't have a cemetery that he can use. He doesn't have a burial site. He needs one. Okay, so in verses 10 through 16, he's trying to strike a deal with Ephron the Hittite to buy some land from him so he can bury Sarah. And then in verses 17 through 20, you have the conclusion of the deal because he puts Sarah in that cave. He puts her body in that cave. Okay, so just a couple of things to point out as you read down through this. And if you all want to take a picture of this, I'd encourage you to. It's actually really fascinating when you go back through and look at the text. If I'm correct, at least 7 different times, this phrase is used, please sell me, please give to me the cave. And, that number 7 is important in Hebrew to the Jewish people. And so you have this, please sell me, please give to me. And then you have this phrase, hear me. And I believe that's used 6 times in the chapter. And that phrase, hear me, Abraham uses it, the Hittites use it, Ephron uses it. That is an official way to communicate a contract where the 2 sides go back and forth. hear me, I'm going to state this provision. No, hear me, I would like this. Hear me, fine, I agree. Hear me. And so they're working out a contract is what they're working. Okay? And then all through the chapter, Abraham's reason for this is he's appealing to their compassion. He's a stranger there. He doesn't have a home. And so the reason he's asking to finally plant a flag, because this is going to be his property now, his reason for it is to bury his beloved wife. And so he's appealing to their compassion. Look, I need a place to put Sarah. And they talk about, well, bury your dead. Go ahead and bury your dead. So the chapter ends with he's following through on the contract. He didn't just use that as a ploy to get the land. He actually put her body there. Does that make sense? So when you go through the text, let me see if I can pull this up here. Yeah, 23. Yeah, mine is all colored up. All these different phrases, the idea of burying, the idea of hearing, the idea of purchasing or giving the land. Abraham in verse 2, weeping and mourning for her. This is just something, a little fascinating tidbit to me. We just made this point in chapter 2. What did Abraham think God was able to do with Isaac if he killed him? Okay, so Abraham is one of the first recorded people who believed in resurrection. Even though he had never seen it and he had never heard of it, he believed that God was a God of resurrection, which I think is amazing. Then you get to chapter 23, and his wife actually dies. So we've just learned that Abraham believes that God is a God of resurrection, but his wife dies, and how does he respond to his wife dying? In a very normal way. He grieves his wife, he mourns for his wife, he cries over his wife.
What would be the point of raising her from the dead?
Well, so put the two things together. How can someone who believes in resurrection grieve a death? Is that consistent or inconsistent?
It's a little consistent if you believe in, well, it's physical resurrection, that's the whole other thing. But if you believe in at least some kind of afterlife, then you agree with both.
Okay, so let's talk about what death is just for a second. What is death? What is the biblical definition of death? Okay, so the technical definition for death is separation. You know, physical death, your body dies, and who you are, your soul, your spirit, whichever synonym you want to use, is separated from your body. You're not inside, your body is going to turn to dirt. But who you are is someplace else. Okay? What is spiritual death? When you're separated from God. Right? And so when you get into passages in the New Testament that talk about the first and the second death, those who are in Christ, we don't have to worry about the second death. We're not going to be separated from God because we're in Christ. We'll experience the first one of our physical bodies, but the second one, we're going to be with God. Okay, now, come back to Genesis 23. What has Sarah just experienced? Physical death. And not just separation from her physical body. Who has she experienced separation from? Abraham. Death is a separation, temporary, because Abraham believes in resurrection. But it's still a separation. And it's appropriate to grieve that separation, even though it's temporary. You know, you think about statements, other statements. So, 2 Samuel 11 and 12, you have David and Bathsheba, and you have the birth of their child, and then later in chapter 12, Nathan comes along, he confronts David, David repents, but Nathan lets him know, the child is going to die. And the child dies, David grieves and prays until the child dies, but then when the child dies, he gets up and goes about his business, and the servants are like, what's going on? How do you explain this? And what does David say? He makes a statement about how he will see him again someday. Yeah, he can't come to me, but I'm going to go to him someday. So in David's mind, there's going to be this reunion of this temporary separation. Death is a temporary separation. So it's totally consistent for a man who believes in resurrection to still grieve the temporary separation from his spouse. I think that's totally normal. Yeah, totally normal. And this is interesting. So the Cave of Machpelah, second to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the Cave of Machpelah has remained throughout history the most sacred monument of the Jewish people. It is traditionally identified with the site the Arabs call Harem el-Khalil, the sacred precinct of the Friend of God, in present-day Hebron. The magnificent surrounding wall of hewn stone goes back to at least the time of Herod, so you're talking first century-ish. During the Byzantine period, a church was built over the sepulchre. Hebron was liberated by the Israel Defense Forces in June 1967. Jews, Christians, and Muslims were then given the freedom to worship inside the cave. So the Cave of Machpelah is where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and there's one more couple buried there, and I'm blanking on their names. But there's another set that are buried in that cave from the patriarchs that make it special to the Hebrews. Okay, so if you have the opportunity to go there, you have to go on the correct day and listen to your tour guides. I personally have not been there, but it's possible to go. Go ahead. The churches that are built on there? Yes, most of the churches in Israel were built by the Catholics. Yeah, so the Catherine the Great, the mother of Constantine, when Constantine converted to Christianity, his mother started traveling all over Israel looking for sites that were special to her son's faith and trying to commemorate them and identify them. So she went through Israel and she would ask the locals, hey, did this happen? Where did it happen? And all of them were like, oh, right over there. And she'd plunk a church building down on top of it. So that's actually beneficial to help market. But unfortunately, what that did is when they would plunk a church down on top of it, it ruined the local topography. Like, they destroyed stuff. It was just, here's a church on the site. All right. The betrothal of Isaac. This has always fascinated me. I'm grateful my parents didn't pull my wedding off this way, but I have no problem doing this for my kids. Is that a double standard or what? I'm okay with that. So in chapter 24, Abraham knows he's declining, and Isaac is creeping on 40 years old. And he does not want his wife, the wife of Isaac, to come from the locals. He wants the wife of Isaac to come from where he and Sarah came from. Right? So in verses 1 and 9, you have Abraham commissioning a servant because Abraham can't make the trip. So he sends a servant back to find somebody for Isaac. And it doesn't say what Isaac thinks about this plan, but this is how he worked it. So just we'll outline the chapter and we'll go back through, kind of like we did with 22. He commissioned the servant. The servant prays when he gets there. He encounters Rebekah. The betrothal is accepted. And then the last paragraph, Rebekah and Isaac become husband and wife. Okay, so that is a really high-level overview of some significant stuff. Let's back up to the beginning of the chapter. Now, Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac." The servant said to him, "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" And Abraham said to him, "See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, who spoke to me and swore to me, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine, only you must not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. What stands out to you from those 9 verses? Okay, I was waiting for someone to bring that up. What questions about the hand under the thigh? Okay. So even from the context, there is some kind of, yes, this is traditional. How do we seal promises today? I'm so glad. I'm so glad it's just a shaking of the hands. Okay, a couple of generations ago, what would they do during the handshake? Some guys would spit into the hand, right? I'm glad we don't do that. Like, that is not COVID acceptable. Now, the idea here, people debate about what the significance of it was. It was culturally normal, but the significance of it, we're not entirely sure. And since we're all adults in the room, it wasn't his thigh. That was a phrase, it was an idiom for his reproductive area, which is even weirder. And there are a couple of ideas. One is this, that you are agreeing that if you break your oath or you break your vow, you're saying, "May God curse my ability to reproduce and have kids." So that's like how serious this vow was. That's a significant vow. Now, we can't say that with 100% certainty, but that seems to make the most sense. It was culturally normal. It was an idiom for that, and it probably meant that. Which is probably why the servant was like, what if I can't get somebody? If I can't figure this out, can I get out of this somehow? And so Abraham gives him an out. If you can't find somebody, we're good. All right? Now, what is Abraham absolutely insistent about? No matter what happens, don't take my kid back there. Okay. Let me ask you guys, why do you think he didn't want his son to go back? I agree with that. Why not? Okay.
So it's interesting because he wants him to have a wife from there,
Yeah.
but he doesn't want him to go there.
Yeah.
And it seems like, you take the girl out of her hand.
That's a great point.
But the promise is to be in Canaan, not to be somewhere else.
Yeah. So the fulfillment of the promises is where they currently are. Okay, so he wants his son to stay where the promises are going to get fulfilled. He knows, this is hard, there seems to be some immorality within that family because it introduces her brother, who ends up being a thorn in their side later. Okay, Laban.
Well, there's some idolatry going on as well.
There is. So I'm wondering if it's more along the lines of they're not as bad as here. Like, at least I know the bad there, and it is not as bad as this. And Sarah came from that stock, so there are exceptions. Maybe I can find another Sarah for him. And he does. He finds a Rebecca. She's of the character of Sarah. Okay? Just something to point out before we lose this. It's interesting, like, Abraham is passing the baton. Sarah has passed away. Abraham is going to pass away in just a little bit. And so someone else the story has to continue through someone. And so it's in this chapter that it continues through Isaac and Rebekah. And so you have some connections between the promises of Genesis 12 and phrases repeated with Isaac here. So in this chapter, when in chapter 12, when God said, leave the land, leave your native land, leave your father's house, go to the land of which I tell you. Those phrases are all here in this chapter. So go to your native land, go to your father's house, go to the land. And then when God promises in Genesis 12, I'm going to bless you, there are promises of blessing here. Promises of, I'm going to make you great, I'm going to make you a great nation. Well, at the end, that promise is repeated to Isaac and Rebekah. And when God tells Abraham back in chapter 12, go to the land of which I show you, that phrase is used 7 times in this chapter to refer to Rebekah. And her brothers ask her, will you go? And she says, yeah, I'm going to go. So in a lot of ways, this chapter is emphasizing Rebekah is a lot like Abraham. She's inheriting some of the promises. She has the same character. She has a similar faith. She doesn't know Isaac. She has never visited Canaan, but she's going to leave everything that's familiar to her to go, just like Abraham left everything that was familiar to him to go. I think that's cool, that it's pointing out that the next generation has a similar character to Abraham. Isn't that neat? Like, God blessed that servant with a good one. And what was the servant's test? Like, we're not going to take the time to read all the way through. He shows up and he's like, God, how am I going to know she's the one? Okay, how many camels? Isn't it 10? Seems like there are 10 camels. And she stays until each camel has had its fill of water. So she's lugging water for all these camels, and she's staying there for hours to make sure that the strangers' camels are taken care of. Like, it's saying a lot about the work ethic and the hospitality of Rebekah. Like, it wasn't some little test that the servant came up with. Okay? And as you read down through the chapter, the servant is emphasizing what he sees as the providence of God. He's introducing himself to a family that has never seen him before. And he's trying to make the connection. I'm coming from Abraham, and Abraham is doing great. God's blessed him. He has all this stuff. By the way, here's some jewelry, here's some gold, here's some rings. He's trying to really sell Abraham, and therefore Isaac. Any thoughts or questions? Like, we could spend even more time on that. Yeah.
I've always thought it's funny, and I'm sure there's a lot culturally that's lost here, but it kind of seems like she puts in like very little effort. Like, oh boy, how are we going to do this? I know.
He has stacked the deck in his favor.
But then he's so proud of his process that he wants to tell the story like the whole chapter.
It repeats itself and repeats itself. Yeah.
To the end, and he's trying to tell the story in Isaac's whatever he
Yeah, right. I think all the details help communicate how thorough he was, and the test that he set up really was stacked in his favor. Like, if this girl showed up, it was going to be no question that she was the one. But if she didn't show up, he was clear of the oath. It was obvious either way, right? And when you get to the end of the chapter, I mean, it's like this big love story in Genesis. She's showing up with her face veiled, which, by the way, was not a common thing. That was not a daily thing. The Israelite women in the Old Testament did not normally veil their faces. But it was a wedding tradition. So think back, when Abimelech saw Sarah, he could tell she was beautiful because she wasn't wearing a veil. But Rebekah's showing up, and she's ready for the wedding. She's ready to meet her groom. And they end up eyes locked. They're done. And then he marries her. And the wedding and marrying Rebekah helps comfort him regarding the loss of his mother. It kind of wraps up the story started back in chapter 23 with the burial of Sarah. He's been grieving the loss of his mother, and Rebekah comforts him about that. Any other ideas there? I heard people walking in the hall. Have we missed the 5-minute? Man, you're just going to let me keep going. We will start in 25, pick up those few verses next week, Lord willing, and we'll keep going. Thank you all for your participation. It's been a fun class.